And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thanks so much for joining us once again. And it's wonderful to have a brand new guest whose name is a blast from the past from my UKIP days, but you'll obviously know her from the screen GB News from Talk, and that is Alex Phillips. Alex, thanks so much for your time today.
Pleasure.
Great to have you on, and so much to discuss. Obviously, there people can find you at that Alex Woman on X and that alexwoman.com, the website, Substack, all of that is available, and the links will be in the description. But Alex was back for, I think, 3 years. You were head of media back in UKIP, was what, 2014, 2015, 2016, around that time?
Yeah, 13, 14, 15. Those were
Yeah.
the years.
And then Brexit Party, and then MEP. What what I'm sure, what was that like? But you're kind of behind the scenes in the media. You were making sure the MEPs look good, which wasn't always an easy task, and I get that. From chatting to Gwen and John and Herman and the work that had to be done. But what was that like for you, being kind of more behind the scenes on the media side, engaging with them, to actually being a directly elected individual?
Well, the great thing is when you're behind the scenes, watching what other people are doing, how they're performing, advising them, setting it up, coming out with the lines to take, sort of trying to drill home the importance of party unity. You've kind of had to learn the lessons yourself along the way. So then you just put them into practice. And well, it was 100-hour weeks doing that job as head of media. It was absolutely insane. I've never worked so hard in my life. My phone would be going off well, it never stopped going off, but I'd be getting up at 5, 6 in the morning, often to go with Nigel to breakfast, TV studios, and staying up until Newsnight was done, where there might be one of ours on that show, or just watching it for the lines to take. And then, of course, throughout the night, you get overnight check calls because someone's due at the BBC Belfast studio at 8 in the morning, and they're phoning me to the 4 o'clock in the morning to make sure they've got their car and things like that. So I can remember just basically never sleeping and subsisting, but it was all worth it, wasn't it? I mean, we had a huge impact on politics, which still resonates today.
A huge impact in politics, and it shows you don't necessarily need to win the Westminster election to actually have such an impact. And UKIP and the Brexit Party showed that. So it's huge. But can I ask you, maybe stepping back a little bit? I read that back whenever you were a student journalist, you had made a film about UKIP. I think it was about probably 2007 or something like that. I'm sure that didn't endear you to some of the people you'd got to know studying. What was that like, maybe standing out, not being a hardcore communist, actually being someone very different? It doesn't necessarily fit into student life. So what was that like, kind of taking a stand in that way?
Well, look, when I was a journalism student, I did that as my final piece. So I was being an objective student. I got the opportunity with ITV Wales during the Easter holidays to go and help them out in the political unit. And it was the Welsh Assembly election. So I'd gotten to know Nigel Farage because there's a sort of moonlighter for ITV Wales. I had been following UKIP around. So I just thought, well, I'll double up and follow them around for my final piece as well. So it wasn't really something we were sort of, talking about or exhibiting in front of classmates. It was sort of work carried out independently for the purpose of submission. It was actually after that when I then went to the BBC and I found myself, it was in their politics unit again back in Wales, and I found myself following UKIP again and coming back into the newsroom and talking about UKIP with the people at BBC Wales, that I suddenly thought, wow, I am not in lockstep with these people. And I felt so alienated and ostracized politically that I decided to leave and go and work for UKIP. And that's how that story began. So it was actually sort of the encounters at the BBC which drove me into the arms of politics rather than a journalism school.
And tell me a little bit about your broadcasting more recently. You're with GB News, and now you've been a talk presenter. You've got fantastic contacts, and that obviously you're not just a talking head, but you bring a whole network, a huge range of individuals from right across the political spectrum through your time. But what's that been like as a standalone presenter on GB News and then Talk?
Yeah, I mean, it all sort of ends up marrying up and becoming one thing. It was a very strange thing to sort of let go of my journalism career to go and work in politics. And I thought it would be a one-way street. I didn't ever envisage I'd find myself a route back into broadcasting. And thank goodness for the emergence of GB News and then Talk that I've been able to do that. And it all marries up together because then you're talking from a position of real life experience. You've got these contacts, you still speak to them on a regular basis, you're following politics, you've worked in politics, you understand politics, you've been out campaigning, so you understand the British public and where they're at as well. So it all sort of comes to bear really in my day-to-day job. The only thing that's difficult, of course, is as a journalist, you do have to try and maintain an objective balance. So I cannot necessarily pin my colours to the mast. I think everybody knows my origins and where I've come from and where I stand politically, but I still have to make sure that I distance myself from party politics.
Now, I want to delve into your spiritual journey, but I want to ask you another thought on the political landscape. Someone who has their finger on the pulse, and where the last year in British politics have been crazy. A party winning with a huge mandate, which was Labour, or not necessarily a mandate, huge number of seats, not necessarily a mandate in percentage. The Tory party, 200-year-old, the most successful political party, being decimated and not recovering. And then into the mix of that, you have Reform actually polling. The latest polls are that Nigel would actually win if there was an election. There may need to be some help from the Tories, but it's very close to having an overall majority. Kind of, how do you see that with, I guess, with your political hat on, not necessarily your talk hat on?
Right. So, I mean, look, the UK is not an outlier in this regard, is it? You look at what's been going on across Europe, indeed across the Western world. America, you might think, well, they haven't blown up their legacy parties. It's still a sort of, slug out between the Democrats and Republicans, but it's slightly different in a presidential system because Donald Trump was essentially not an anything when he then sort of decided to be the Republican candidate, and the president can bring their own flavour of politics. It's very different to a prime ministerial system, which is why I think the two-party system hasn't been decimated in the USA. I think we're on the cusp of doing that in the UK. I mean, that's what it looks like now, the early signs. But I do think there's a long way to go to the next general election. It'll be interesting to see what the establishment does to try and essentially preserve the legacy parties and block there being this huge populist political earthquake.
Download the Getter app right now. It's totally free. It's where I put up exclusively all of my content 24 hours a day. You want to know what Steve Bannon's thinking? Go to Getter.
So don't wait. Download the Getter app now.
Sign up for free and be part of the movement.
I've been surprised at the move from the media to hitting Nigel and seeing him as the most dangerous man. I'm sure there are many headlines with that written. And now actually very open and lauded, maybe because of respect to what he's done, maybe because concerns of a failure of 14 years of Tory government and a year of Labour to do anything with the underlying issues in the UK. But how do you see that move from the media towards sheer hatred and anger to actually acceptance and even liking possibly Nigel?
I think many people in the media have always liked Nigel, which is why he's always had a big media profile, because he's an excellent performer and he gets great ratings, and it sort of adds a bit of liveliness and candour to the debate. But when it comes to public sentiment, the media are always chasing the Overton window. They're never ahead of it, let alone even inside it. And many people in the media are still sort of anti-Farageist and very much on the left wing of politics. But I mean, it's sort of the front tends to be led by the print press. And what I've noticed is the Sun especially and other print newspapers are giving Reform a fair hearing. The Sun recently gave Nigel a big double-page interview. They like to make sure that they know that they're publishing a newspaper that appeals to the masses. They've looked at that polling, and for market forces, they're going, right, we need to sort of give Reform a good airing. And I think the broadcasters tend to then follow suit. They can't deny what's going on in the polling. I mean, I remember when I was head of media for UKIP trying to call together a press conference about policy, and they just weren't interested in talking about policy. It'd be the peccadillos of candidates. It'd be something that Nigel said 5 years ago. It'd be a particular election poster from the previous campaign. They didn't, if we turned around and said we wanted to do X, Y, and Z, and we had a blimmin' good 2015 UKIP manifesto, it would have been worth interrogating. I think the general public would have liked a lot of it. And it's interesting, actually, from that manifesto, to see how many of those policies subsequently were then used by other political parties. But the media just weren't interested in that. The big change has been when Nigel's talking about policies and things that he wants to do were he the Prime Minister, because there's a real possibility that could happen. They're beginning to listen.
I guess it's moving away from a party of characters that are an opposition party to a party of policy and moving forward to possible government. And that's quite a change from where UKIP were to where Reform is now.
Yeah, no, exactly. A massive learning curve. I mean, look, arguably one could say that when it comes to seasoned and experienced politicians, Nigel's got far more miles on the clock than Sir Keir Starmer and most of the cabinet of the Labour Party. But it's a very different thing if you've not actually been in a position to act as a shadow government, because when you're a shadow government, you might think, oh, well, the Labour Party, they're brand new ministers. They've never held these positions before, but they would have been shadowing those departments, watching how they work, getting to know the members of the civil service. And so that is an opportunity that Reform has been denied. And so how they then go about preparing themselves for government is a really big question. I'm sure one that they are wrestling with, and it might require finding friendly faces who might want to aid the operation in the Conservative Party, who can be trusted and who are ideologically on side. But I think as we get closer to that general election, it will be interesting if the polling stays as it is now, whether there is some sort of call to make sure that at least the 5 MPs that Reform currently have might be able to go in and shadow certain departments and learn the ropes. I have a feeling, however, that the establishment aren't going to be as generous and open-spirited as that, and that they might start looking at more drastic manoeuvres to prevent Reform actually forming a government.
Oh, Nigel certainly is a threat to both of the uni party. I could talk about media all day, but I want to talk to you about something completely different, and it was your post on your baptism, which really, really did intrigue me. And you were baptized by someone who's I've got to know recently. I saw a mutual friend, and that's Father Phil Harris, or Father Canon Phil Harris. And I watched that, and I'd love to know a little bit about that journey. Maybe taking you back to growing up. It's always interesting to know what someone's background was in terms of spiritual influence, in terms of like going to the church, or was there like prayer before meals or that sort of thing. So what was it like for you growing up in terms of any religious or spiritual input?
Right. Well, we didn't grow up in a religious household at all. I wasn't christened. We weren't particularly having those conversations around the dinner table. But, I went to a primary school where we sang, children's hymns. I went to a senior school which had Christian-led assemblies. I was in the Brownies and the Girl Guides where we had our moments in church. I was in the school choir where we would sing all the Christmas carols and so on and so forth. So undeniably brought up in what then was an unapologetically Christian country. As I was in my youth, I think it's less so now. I think it's becoming dangerously secularized. But it was really, I've had an interesting route round to Christianity, and I won't bore you with the long details, but after studying philosophy at university, I went over to work in India and became fascinated by Hinduism and the metaphysics of Hinduism. And for a long time, actually, sort of found Hinduism really fascinating and delved deeper and deeper into it. Now, my brother was the first to convert to Christianity back when he was 21, so over 20 years ago. And I remember at the time, in my family, we all thought it was really quite odd because we hadn't been religiously inclined at all. In fact, we were probably quite concerned. What's happened to him? Why has he got so brainwashed? How has this suddenly come to pass? Who's got to him? Why has he suddenly become a Christian? Which, looking back now in retrospect, now I've done the same, is quite ironic. But I then at some point started to sort of get that nagging sensation I think most people have, which is, what is this country culturally? What have we gotten rid of? What is this Christianity that we've sort of osmotically absorbed for most of our upbringing, but just never really done anything to preserve? What are we losing here? And so I just decided I wanted to start understanding Christianity. It is the religion of this country. And I found as I did that, and as I sort of took an academic bent towards Christianity, it began to affect me spiritually. Because when it's like anything else, when people go, oh, well, I don't believe, oh, it'd be lovely to be a Christian, but I'm just not. I always say, well, have you read the Bible? Have you actually tried it? Why do you just say, oh, I can't do it, or it's not in me? The first thing, if anyone's curious, is to actually go to church or open the Bible. And that's what I started doing quite a few years ago now. And for 4 years, I've been going to church increasingly and feeling like I really wanted to get baptized because I felt like a bit of a fraud. If you're sort of going along to church and saying, this interests me, I want to be part of this club, I believe in all of this stuff, and I want to commit my life to upholding its values, you kind of want to then go and actually get that properly done. And it was sort of an ad hoc decision, really. I've been trying to do it and trying to coordinate it for so long. And in the end, there was just this wonderful opportunity. And I found the people who have been part of my Christian journey and said, look, would you be available on this day? And they were. So we just went and did it.
What was it? An interest in history because Britain have got a long tradition, long history of Christian input influence. Was it the culture wars that we're seeing, which is making people think, where is the anchor for a country? Kind of, which area was it that made you think or you delved into? Because I think there's always a trigger that makes people think, or an issue or a story or an event in family that makes them really think about it.
Yeah, I think it's a number of things. I think, first of all of these neo-religions that have been imposed upon us from the top down. If anyone sort of tells you the whole climate change thing has been driven from the, working class people from the bottom up, it's rubbish. I don't know anyone who's taking the streets and campaigning to save the planet. It's something that's being imposed from the top down. The same is very much true of trans rights. And then, other sorts of things, cultural, revisionism, historical revisionism, multicultural, all these things that have sort of become new religious doctrines. This is how morality is now going to be written. And actually, I think it was the Gay Marriage Act that first made me realize, hang on, there's something very strange going on here when the government, and back then I wasn't a Christian, but I did think it's really off that the government is telling the Church of England what it should do. Is it effectively overriding the Bible? And would they dare do that to any other religion? And and like a lot of people, I sort of thought we've lost our glue. And in that vacuum, we've got all sorts of divisive, toxic neo-ideologies, which are sort of zealous in their approach, in their conversionism, falling into that space. And perhaps we need to look at what bound us together before and underpins our culture and underpins our morality and underpins our social mores. And I think that a lot of people are now waking up to feel that way as well. And I think a lot of people also say, yeah, wouldn't it be great if there were more people going to church? Wouldn't it be great if we could get that back again? But they themselves don't think that they should be one of the people sitting on the pews. Well, I'd say this, if it's you saying, wouldn't it be great if the church could have some sort of revival? Well, it kind of starts with the individual to be part of that.
Because there are two ways of responding if you've got a concern of the changes that are happening in our society. One is saying we need kind of Christian ideals or ideas or a kind of belief system, and we can implement that maybe in teaching good ideas that come from the Bible. And the other way is actually, I'm curious to actually what Christianity itself teaches. I mean, how Jesus lived. I want to open up the Bible and go. And there's that cultural acceptance that cultural Christianity has a place, but also the personal side. And often people go down the understanding of cultural Christianity, but that doesn't have a personal impact. So those are two different. Why do you go one way and not the other, I guess, my question?
Well, look, it's a very interesting question. But essentially, I think it boils down to this. Everything that is sort of what is considered Western or even global morality now comes from Christianity. It comes from the religion that taught tolerance. It comes from the religion that teaches forgiveness. It comes from the religion that teaches love. And it underpins the Western democratic systems, the Western legal systems, which in turn have largely been the ones adopted by supranational entities like the UN, like, the EU. And so cultural Christianity, even the calendar we use is based upon the birth of Jesus. I think that it sort of underpins a lot of even global morality or global communal morality as it is. But what I think we've realized in the United Kingdom is all of those elements have been brought into play within our democratic system, within our legal system. But when you take the individual out, when you then take the religion out of it and you're just left with the mood music of be kind, if you will, it gets hijacked, right? And all of a sudden you find yourself being forced to be tolerant of intolerance, for example. You kind of have the message of Jesus bastardized into we've got to be kind to everybody and do everything for everybody, no matter what. You've always got to turn the other cheek. This sort of hyper acceptance, which I think has actually allowed some pretty horrible things to take root in this country. And so you realize that actually, if you take the mood music away and you get rid of the manuscript, at some point the mood music's going to get, distorted, and it's going to be adopted by things that really don't belong there. And you've got to go back to the original source material to understand what it's laying out and why. I do think that, the Bible is very challenging for many people in the 21st century, particularly the Old Testament, because it reflects an era within which societies were very different. But at the same time, I think that those people who want to study theology, you actually want to study the messaging of the Bible, it is still worth going back to and reading it and understanding it and looking at the parables and looking at the stories and the messaging and even actually investigating the historical character of Christ. There's few people out there who would deny that he existed or even, or deny that he was crucified. And there's no one out there, I don't think, who could deny the impact that this one individual has had on 2,000 years of history. So whether you believe the God element and the virgin birth and the resurrection, in some respects is immaterial, because it's very clear that this one individual has been the most significant person throughout global history to change the morality of the entire world, to move us from the ancient era into the modern era. So there's got to be something there.
Much more than a good man, much more. When you approach, what was it like? I became a Christian when I was 6. I remember vividly. So very different background to you, and struggled with that later on as a teenager, and had to decide, is this really true or not? And then it's absolutely true and affects every part of your life. But for you you look at the Bible, it's big. It's huge. Then you think church. Well, there's so many churches. Where do I go? Where did you start in terms of opening up the Bible? If you get into Leviticus or something, it's going to be heavy going.
Well,
So where do you start?
Well, actually, I did what most people do, start at the beginning with Genesis and then with Leviticus next. Yeah. Super off-putting, and you're just like, what on earth am I grappling with here? But it's more like, you feel like with something like that, you can't do it alone. And so I wanted to go to church, and it was my dear friend Belinda who sort of said to me, I reckon there's this church in Knightsbridge that you really get along with. If you want to go to church, maybe you should try Holy Trinity Brompton. So I was like, okay. Wow. So I started going there, and I did find that was the shoe that fit perfectly. I suddenly realized that I'd been missing that for most of my life. I'm kind of glad in a strange way that I wasn't sort of brought up as a Christian by my family. In a strange way, I'd want my children to be brought up Christian though, so that is a bit hypocritical. But in a way, it was quite nice that I was sort of imbued with Christianity. I was contextually Christian, but I made that decision as an adult, because I think a lot of people, when they feel as a child they've been forced to believe something, then do go through that period when they're older where they question it and have to wrestle with it. And some people never come back, whereas as an adult, you've sort of picked your own path to get to that point. So it feels sort of very sincere, and because I've worked for it and worked at it, it's not something that I think is going to dissipate at any point in the future. I don't think I'm going to wake up in about 10 years time and go, oh, that was a mistake, because I've entered it as an adult, fully cognizant of what I was doing. So I'm kind of grateful for that.
And HTB is great church in that you go in, you're not forced, you can slip in and out. You can begin to see what it's like sitting on the back on the sofa and having a cup of tea and a croissant in the morning. It's a very gentle opening where people can think churches are intense and sitting on a hard pew and being told off. And HTB it's because I've been to HTB quite a number of times, and it's a great place to start. I think it's important for people to think kind of where do they go, and to reach out to those they know who are Christians, find out where they go, and try and find somewhere that fits for you, because churches are different and different personalities, so we can fit into different churches.
Yeah, and that is so important. And I'm glad there's a plurality of churches and the types of churches, from gospel churches to Methodist to Baptist to very strict Anglican to Catholic. And there is a sort of sense that you've got to find your community and the way that you most engage with the text and with the sermons. And HTB is the fastest growing church network in the United Kingdom, if not the world. It's planting churches all over the place. The Alpha course that it runs is reaching millions of people, particularly overseas. It is a massive evangelizing church, and I think it's having so much success because it's modern. Okay, it's just modern. That doesn't make it bad. There are people out there who, for whatever reason, thinks that everything needs to be done in a sort of Victorian mindset. The hymns have to say "thou art" and all the rest of it. and that there has to be this sort of call and answer from the priest to the, congregation, and it's got to be a specific form of words. And yet, my personal interpretation of the Bible is Jesus didn't really do that stuff. Jesus got on, put his sandals on and just went where the crowds were and spoke to them like normal people. He went to where the need was, and there wasn't this sense of very strict ceremony around everything. If anything, he sort of busted some of those myths. When Mary Magdalene came to wash his feet and her hair was uncovered, he said, "Don't you worry, love, you don't have to put that scarf back on, and I love the fact you're washing my feet. Thank you, that's really kind." He was a revolutionary. And so I think that the importance of church is to keep pace with society and make itself relevant by not by changing its fundamentals, though. And this is what the Church of England has often gotten wrong. It's not changed its communication style. It's changing its doctrine based upon political pressures, based upon societal pressures from non-Christians. And that to me is really strange, because that's supposed to be the linchpin. That's the immovable part. Now, how you dress it up and how you display it and how you invite people to be part of it, I think it can be very flexible. And it's important that it is, much like the Tower of Babel, if you want to get lots of people into church and coalescing around a shared morality and a shared sense of community and belief, then you've got to be able to reach as many people as possible. And so I think having a sort of staid and strict, there's one way only to do Christianity is not very helpful in the long run. But it's good to see that this one particular part of the Church of England is having a huge resurgence and when I go to HTB now, you can't even get into the main church building. You have to be down in an annex room or in the basement, or, it's like getting cues from a 90s nightclub to go to the Sunday service, which is wonderful. More of that, please.
No, it is. And same experience with me, just in the same borough, Kensington Temple, where again you're now queuing to get into the 9 or 11 o'clock services, and it's packed. And I don't think the media. I've seen a couple of articles on HTB, but I don't think the public realise the growth that's happening in churches, the hunger that people have for meaning, for connection. And especially after the decimation of relationships during COVID, people are looking for meaning, and I think that's why churches like HTB are just really exploding.
I think there's something else going on here as well. It's not just people looking for meaning, and that's a huge part of it. But I also think that what they've seen is a number of other religions coming into the country who are very robust in their worldview, who are watering down their doctrines or ideologies, who are quite assertive about how they want to have the way of life in this country. And perhaps we've sort of gone, we've been a bit soft. We need to be more assertive over our own way of life. And I think I'm not saying this is true of everybody, but I think there's also this sort of subconscious existential feeling that actually, if you're going to begin to counter the forces of other cultures coming in and trying to dominate the discourse, then you kind of need to be part of that yourself in your own country. So I think that's also something, as well as the connection, as well as the looking for meaning. I think there is this idea that, well, what are we coalescing around? Actually, we can all go to church. We can be members of this.
No, I think I'd like to pray for Islam to have lots of Welbys in leadership roles, and that may cause chaos. But for you, some people have like a Damascus Road experience, that of Saul on the horse and being knocked off, and God speaking to him, and immediately you realize who God is. Other people, it's a process, and for you, it seems to have been a process of curiosity, going to church, hearing more, reading the Bible, beginning to understand, and then at some point you have to make a decision. But is this true or not?
Yeah, I mean, it's two things. Anybody who is converted to Christianity in adult life, I'm sure would say to anybody else that actually, if you stand there and wait for God to come down on the lightning bolt, he ain't going to do it. Okay. It doesn't work like that. That's like having your eyes shut and trying to look for something. It can't really work like that. And I think that most people have done what I did and sort of pushed the door open an inch, suddenly finds the door is flung open faster than you expected. And then they do end up having their own personal experiences, which become very meaningful. But you've got to be wanting to engage. If God and the universe, if you will, don't know that you're interested, they're not going to come knocking on your door. And the minute you show a little bit of interest, it's quite remarkable, actually, that, the little miracles that happen in daily life, which then concretizes that process. I don't want to get into those things because they're very highly personal. When we pray and we find that our prayers, we get that really distinct feeling that our prayers have been listened to, or when we have those sort of set of coincidences that you suddenly realize are no longer coincidences, that there is this banging on the door, there is this sort of effort from the other side really to engage you. For a non-believer, it's very hard to describe those things, because they'll just think, well, she's gone a bit balmy, or, oh, well, she would think like that because. But anyone who's been on that journey probably knows exactly what I'm talking about. But it is about, the personal experience of an individual. And like I said, I think most people, if they push that door just a little bit, that's all that's needed. But so many people stand there with the door shut, expecting it to be opened for them. It just can't work like that.
Or you have to, as I said, knock and the door be open. So nudge it. I want to ask you about baptism, because it's a really public, really fairly intense, crazy idea in terms of how non-Christians would see it. And I grew up in a Baptist church, so I maybe see things a little bit differently. But it is, and I've seen this resurgence of actually people want to get baptized and actually becoming Christians. In Kenton Temple 3 weeks ago, we had 50 people getting baptized, and there are another 60 getting baptized, I think, in a month or so. And you realize that actually people not only becoming Christians, but they want that public. They don't want to be a private thing. And I think in Britain, we all talk about, faith being a personal issue, where in America, it's rah-rah, it's like loud in your face. But baptism kind of connects those and bridges them, and it's a personal. So tell me about that and why you want to get baptized, because many people want to be a Christian, want to live their lives for Christ, for good, but actually baptism is a strange concept and maybe too public. So tell us why you made that step, and it was a public step, not only in terms of people there, but actually on social media also.
Well, I mean, in theory, you've got to get baptized, okay? That's the first thing that happened with Jesus. He went to see his cousin, John the Baptist, and got baptized. Baptism is fundamental to saying, I am now a Christian. And the process of being in the water, immersing yourself and washing away your sins and essentially being reborn, starting again as somebody who is going to be of service to God, where you are redeemed because of what happened on the cross. So baptism is very important. You can't say, I'm a Christian, but I don't want to get baptized. To me, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't have to be a public thing at all. Do you know what's interesting? And various people have different interpretations of the Bible. So I'm not, I am not Justin Welby. I'm not going to stand here and proselytize about what is the right or wrong.
Thank you, God.
But frankly speaking, some people might suggest that if you wanted to get baptized, you can have two people who are Christians just dunk your head in the sink. Yeah. You can do it that way. I wanted to have it done properly. And that's one of the reasons actually that I, been speaking to Father Phil, who insisted that it was done properly. He said, you're random, you're going to go and do this somewhere weird, aren't you? You're not going to, go and do it in a church or this, that and the other. And the other thing is about HTB. You might say, well, why didn't I get baptized there? For a long time, I was working the Sunday show at Talk. And so I just wasn't making the services. I'd be watching it online. And it's a big church as well. And yes, you can join little groups as part of the church. But I just found it very difficult with such pressing commitments and traveling around a lot to engage in the church in the way that I wanted to. And so being able to organize a baptism through that route just wasn't really viable. And my brother, and it was my brother and his wife who were there at the baptism. That's why I went down to Eastbourne, where they live. We've been talking about doing it in their way, because at their church, people go and get baptized in the sea. And I thought, well, that's a lovely thing to do, isn't it? And I wanted my brother's wife to be a part of that, because she's been played such a huge role in my journey towards God. And so, yeah, it was they were doing baptisms in the sea the day before, actually, at my brother's church. And it's why he couldn't come and attend a joint family thing we were doing. And I said, well, can I come down on the Monday and do it? And he was like, oh, don't see why not. I can get some people from my church along. So I phoned Father Phil, and he was like, do you know what? It's my day off, but I can get on that train, and we're going to do it properly. And you're going to have the certification. You're going to have the proper liturgy. He even put on his full blimmin' robes and got into the sea. So it's really nice, because it was sort of done in a very personal way that was unique to me and the people who have been part of my journey to Christianity. But it was proper. It wasn't, some sort of Instagram moment. It wasn't sort of like, the bucket challenge or something like that. I wasn't actually going to put it online at all. It wasn't, this was for me. It wasn't for the wider world. And it was a strange thing. After I'd been baptized, I was walking back. We booked a hotel on the seafront so we could go and get changed and dry off. And I was walking back to the hotel with Father Phil. And I just remember we walked into the reception and he was talking about something and the chain effects of a baptism and how, you know, me being baptized might be that, you know, it encourages other people to do the same, or what my role is going to be in service to God. And that's when I thought, it's not something I should be ashamed of. And it's not something I'm doing for political point scoring. And I thought, do you know what? This has been so important to me. I'm going to share it with my followers. I'm just going to put up this video and say, I got baptized today. And it was the most important day of my life, which it was. And so I did that. I was amazed at the engagement. I mean, I don't know where it's at now. Last time I checked, it was on at least 500,000 people had interacted with that video. And I did something I don't normally do, which is I read the comments underneath the post, which anybody in my position should know never to do, because it's a mental health catastrophe. But I did. I wanted to know how people were reacting to it. And yes, there were one or two voices of, oh, guys, another one, a sort of woke right wing, you know, very online right, whatever, pretending to be a Christian. But actually, apart from very, very rare voices, so many people underneath were so either Christians themselves and really welcoming and touched by this. But there were other people who had said, I want to do that now. I think that looks like a really great thing to do. I've been thinking about it, or I hadn't been thinking about it till I saw your video, and now I want to go to church. And so what Father Phil said to me as we walked back to the hotel about the sort of butterfly effect and the chain reaction and what God's purpose is for an individual. And that conversation really being the thing that made me think, okay, I should share this. It's not something to be ashamed of. You know, even if my conversion to Christianity and the you know, public posting of my baptism got just one person to also do the same, you never know. That person could go on to be the next unwoke Archbishop of Canterbury. Do you know what I mean? You don't understand necessarily, you know, God's plan and why certain things happen. But I was overwhelmed, frankly, with the positivity that I got in reaction to putting that online.
Tell me how that fits in with the media side, because you're someone of prominence. Many people watch your show, they watch your feeds, they take what you say not necessarily as gospel, but as an understanding of what's happening. How does that? Because that is a responsibility. I mean, I have talked to Calvin whenever Calvin started. Of course, he dressed up in the full garb, but and you realize it was a responsibility for people in the media to actually live as Christians and to try and bring truth, especially in media news, which can often be so negative. So how do you see that, your faith kind of coming into the media sphere?
I am so glad now that I can every morning pray to God. Sorry if people aren't Christian, sorry if it's going to get heavy. But it's such a wonderful thing to be able to wake up knowing I'm baptized, to be able to communicate with God and say to him, you know, Lord, please put the right words in my mouth. Give me a temperate spirit. Know that I want to work in your service to make this country as good as possible, but make sure I don't alienate. You know, if I'm doing something that, you know, isn't in your plan, or, you know, that you think is good Christian behavior, then please, you know, basically have your hand upon me. Give me the Holy Spirit. Enable me to navigate this world where I've got this, you know, position of, you know, I'm not, you know, huge sort of character. I'm not an A-list, but I have got a position where people do occasionally listen to my points of view. So I want to make sure that's a great responsibility, and I want to make sure I get it right. And one human being alone can't suddenly go, right, that's it, I've figured it all out at the age of 41. My morality is this. I'm set in my ways. This is 100% how it's going to be. Aren't I great? No, we're so uniquely fallible. And sometimes we don't understand things that we think we understand. Sometimes we're foolhardy. Sometimes we don't do things that we should do, and we do things we shouldn't do. And so being able to pray every day for that sort of guidance is extremely useful. But also, like I said, engaging with the Bible. There's this brilliant app actually called The Bible in 1 Year, another HTV thing by Nikki Gumbel. And it's almost like a sort of miniature school assembly for adults. The sort of process, it's a daily 15 minutes recording you can listen to, and it will take different parts of the Bible with an overarching message and a little prayer and a sort of mini sermon in there. Very modern, very easy to navigate. And over the course of 365 days, you've essentially covered the whole of the Bible. And it's amazing. So I often put that on, and sometimes I'll listen to something and the message in it, and it will change the way I might have approached something that day. I think to myself, actually, I must go and be brave here and put my head above the parapet and not worry about the backlash I'm going to get, because I'm doing this for the right reasons. I'm doing this from a position where I think this is the morally correct thing to do. Other times I'll think, well, hang on, if you go banging that drum, you are going to upset people. You are going to isolate people. You are going to alienate people. You're not going to be bringing people with you. And so I think actually when you've got this position of responsibility and a platform in media, it really does help to have recourse to a higher power and realize as a human being, you're going to screw up a lot of stuff and you're going to have a lot of things that you need to pray for forgiveness over.
Yeah, exactly. Reminds me of a verse, one of the Psalms, commit your ways to the Lord, trust him and he will help you. And you find the Bible is, when you open it up and read it, there'll be times where you read it and you think, I want to get through this, and there might be a part that's heavy going, but then there'll be other times you open it up and you think, wow, that kind of verse, okay, that now affects and changes what I'm going to do today, and it shines a light. And that's something to commit everything you do to God, because he actually will help you in all you do.
Yeah, as Father Phil always says, and I love this, I've taken this mantra on, because do you know what? It's a really great mantra. So Father Phil always says, let go, let God. And when I look at the mental health,
that's difficult.
It is difficult. But when I look at the mental health crisis we have in this country, when I look at how people are riddled with anxiety, where actually life is, in many respects, I'm not talking about sort of, disparity of wealth, but in many respects, life in 2025 is better than it's ever been. Okay, genuinely it is. In terms of everyone has smartphones and energy and a roof over their head and a state that supports them through welfare, and with medical cures where they didn't exist, people are living longer, etc., etc. And yet we are the most stressed out, upset, anxious, doubting nation, generation that's ever existed. And I wonder if part of that is because people don't know how to let go, because they don't have that higher belief. They don't have the God at which they can lay their troubles and anxieties at their feet and say, it's in your plan. I'm going to trust you. I'm going to, put this on you, and try and sort of take a step back and a deep breath and pray that everything's going to be okay. And also having that moral structure and that guidance, that because, Christianity teaches so much that you are loved. He goes back for that last sheep, that you as an individual are so special to him, and that he's listening to you and he wants the best for you. And guess what? Here's the best self-help book ever written for how to be a happy and content person. I think about all the, girls out there who are sort of struggling so much in this hypersexualized world in which we live, with the instant gratification, particularly when it comes to intimacy and relationships. And you look at that through the prism of, well, if you were, a Christian, and, you sort of, the very much the teachings of the New Testament, I think, add a lot of worth to women and a lot of protections in place. The idea of the importance of marriage, of monogamy, those things are there really to protect women more than they are men. They do help men as well. But when I look at the mental health crisis, I kind of think that part of that is because we took God away from people. We took away that sort of overarching umbrella feeling of being part of something, but also having a security, having almost like an insurance policy.
No, exactly. Alex, I really appreciate you coming on. It's interesting when you interview people whose names and have kind of seen from afar. It wasn't on my list of having you on talking about your baptism and convert, but it shows that God has a plan for each of us, and it's not necessarily what we expect. So, thank you so much for giving us your time and talking about something which is fairly personal as well, and not very British, talking about faith, but after you put that online, I just thought I have to have Alex coming on talking about it. So thank you for sharing your experience with us, your faith journey and your baptism.
Thank you.